The story opens with a chilling narration that explains how Spartan warriors are not simply born, they are forged. From the very first breath, a Spartan child's fate is decided. Newborns are inspected carefully by elders, and any sign of weakness is seen as unacceptable. Those deemed unfit are taken to the edge of a cliff and cast down into a dark abyss below, a place already filled with the remains of others who failed to meet Sparta's brutal standards. For the ones who survive, life only gets harder. Boys are raised to become soldiers, not children. By the age of 7, they are taken away from their families and thrown into a merciless training system. They endure relentless punishments, including severe beatings that they must withstand without showing pain. They are abandoned in freezing conditions, forced to survive on their own before earning the right to return. Every step of their upbringing is designed to eliminate weakness and build warriors who know nothing but discipline, endurance, and war. Back in Sparta, the city is alive with tension as a Persian envoy arrives, riding boldly through its streets. He demands an audience with King Leonidas, carrying a grim warning. In his hand, he holds the skulls of rulers who dared to oppose his master. The message is clear before he even speaks. Escorted before the king, the messenger announces that he speaks for Xerxes, a ruler who has already crushed countless nations, including powerful Greek cities like Athens. Now, Sparta is expected to kneel and submit. As the tension rises, Queen Gorgo steps forward and speaks with confidence. Her voice cuts through the room, but the envoy reacts with visible anger, shocked that a woman would speak so boldly among men. Without hesitation, she answers him, stating that Spartan women are the ones who give birth to true warriors. The envoy warns Leonidas to think carefully, reminding him that defiance would lead to destruction. But the king has already made his decision. With cold determination, he steps forward, spear in hand, forcing the messenger and his guards backward toward a massive pit. The envoy protests, claiming that harming a messenger violates sacred laws, but Leonidas shows no concern for such rules. With a single, iconic declaration, "This is Sparta," he kicks the envoy and his soldiers into the darkness below. Despite his defiance, Sparta is bound by tradition. The king cannot declare war without consulting the oracle and the mysterious ephors, priests who appear almost otherworldly. High in the mountains, the oracle resides, a young woman of striking beauty, yet trapped in a life she never chose. Under the influence of strange rituals and intoxicants, she delivers visions of the future. Leonidas climbs to meet the ephors, bringing offerings as required. He explains his intention to march north and confront Xerxes before his forces grow even stronger. When he seeks guidance from the oracle, she delivers a grim prophecy. If Sparta goes to war, it will fall. Using this prophecy as justification, the ephors forbid Leonidas from marching, citing an upcoming sacred festival. The king is left frustrated, unwilling to accept inaction while an unstoppable army approaches. By the next morning, Leonidas makes his move anyway. He gathers a force of just 300 Spartan warriors, his personal guard. Among them, he notices a young soldier, the son of his trusted captain. The king questions whether the boy understands the weight of what lies ahead, but his father stands firm. The young warrior, proud and unshaken, chooses to stand with them. As they prepare to leave, a politician named Thuron confronts the king, reminding him that the law forbids war. Leonidas calmly replies that he is not leading an army, he is simply going for a walk, accompanied by his bodyguards. As the 300 march out, they encounter a group of Arcadian soldiers who have come to join the resistance. However, their leader is surprised and concerned by how few Spartans are present. Leonidas responds in his own way. He asks one of the Arcadians what he does for a living. The man answers that he is a sculptor. Others say they are blacksmiths or potters. Then Leonidas turns to his own men and asks the same question. Instead of trades, the Spartans respond with a unified roar, a thunderous declaration of who they are. Warriors, every single one of them. With that, Leonidas confidently states that his army is larger than it appears. Together, the combined forces move toward the coast, where reality quickly sets in. The horizon is filled with an overwhelming number of Persian ships, far more than anyone expected. The sheer scale of Xerxes' power becomes undeniable. That night, however, nature intervenes. A violent storm tears through the Persian fleet, destroying many of their ships. For a brief moment, hope rises among the Spartans and their allies. But by morning, it becomes clear that the damage has barely slowed the invasion. Still, the Spartans remain composed. They are not afraid. In fact, they welcome the battle. To them, dying in service of Sparta is the highest honor they can achieve. As they begin constructing a defensive wall, another Persian envoy approaches, once again offering surrender. He promises riches, safety, and mercy for their families if they submit. He even mocks their crude wall, until he notices something unsettling. The ground nearby is already littered with the bodies of Persian soldiers. Before the envoy can fully react, a Spartan warrior steps forward and violently cuts off his arm. He is sent back alive, carrying a clear message to Xerxes: the war has already begun. Soon after, the Spartans realize they are not alone. They have been followed. A shadowy figure emerges, revealing himself as Ephialtes, a man whose body is twisted and whose past is filled with rejection. Despite his condition, he begs Leonidas to let him fight alongside them. But what he reveals next is even more important. He knows of a hidden path through the mountains, one that could allow the Persian army to outflank them entirely. And just like that, the stakes become even higher. Although Ephialtes proves he can handle a spear, there is one critical problem. He cannot raise and hold a Spartan shield properly. For Leonidas, that alone makes him unfit. He explains that Spartan combat is not just about individual strength. Every soldier must protect the man beside him, forming an unbreakable wall. If one fails, the entire line collapses. The rejection cuts deep. Humiliated and furious, Ephialtes storms away, his desire to belong now turning into resentment. Soon after, the first clash begins. The Spartans take position within a narrow pass, forcing the massive Persian army into a tight space where numbers lose their advantage. They wait patiently, and when the enemy advances, the Spartans strike with brutal precision. The result is devastating. The first wave is completely wiped out, leaving the battlefield covered in bodies. As they catch their breath, the Persians respond with a different tactic. A storm of arrows fills the sky, so dense it blocks out the sun itself. But instead of panic, the Spartans stand united, raising their shields in perfect formation. The arrows rain down harmlessly, and the Spartans mock their enemies, calling them cowards for attacking from a distance. After the chaos settles, both sides pause to regroup and clear the fallen. That's when Xerxes finally appears. He towers over everyone, his presence overwhelming, his appearance almost otherworldly. Covered in piercings and adorned like a living symbol of power, he approaches Leonidas with confidence. Once again, he offers him a choice. Kneel and Sparta will be spared. Leonidas doesn't hesitate. With dry humor, he refuses, joking that his legs are too exhausted from defeating Xerxes' army. The insult doesn't land lightly. Xerxes' tone shifts instantly. He promises to erase Sparta completely, not just physically, but from memory itself. He threatens to silence anyone who dares speak their name, ensuring they are forgotten forever. Then he reveals his next move, the Immortals. These elite warriors step forward, masked figures with hollow, menacing eyes, dressed in dark armor trimmed with gold. They move like something inhuman, wielding heavy chain weapons designed to tear through anything in their path. But even they are not enough. The Spartans meet them head-on. The fight is fierce, and this time, losses are felt. Yet in the end, the Immortals fall like the rest. Watching from afar, Xerxes' illusion of godhood begins to crack. As the narration reminds us, beneath all the spectacle, he is still just a man. The battles grow more intense with each passing moment. Xerxes unleashes everything: war beasts, towering creatures, and soldiers from distant lands, each more terrifying than the last. The scale becomes overwhelming, and when his forces fail to break the Spartans, Xerxes responds with cruelty, punishing his own commanders for their failures. In the midst of this chaos, tragedy strikes. The captain's son, young, proud, and eager to prove himself, is killed in battle. The loss shatters his father. The captain breaks down, consumed by grief and rage, needing several men to hold him back as he struggles to process what has happened. At the same time, Ephialtes' path takes a darker turn. He is brought before Xerxes, where the contrast is impossible to ignore. Surrounded by luxury, music, and endless indulgence, Ephialtes is offered something he has never had: acceptance. Wealth, power, a place where he is no longer rejected. Tempted by everything he sees, he makes his choice. He betrays the Spartans. He reveals the hidden mountain path, the very route that can be used to circle around and trap Leonidas and his men. Back in Sparta, a different kind of battle is unfolding. Queen Gorgo seeks help from Thuron, hoping to convince the council to send reinforcements. Their conversation quickly turns dark. Thuron questions her intentions, then makes it clear the council will not act unless she gives him what he wants. Reluctantly, she agrees, but the situation spirals beyond control. Thuron takes advantage of her, only to reveal afterward that it meant nothing. No deal, no support. Meanwhile, at the battlefield, Leonidas speaks with Dilios, who has lost an eye in combat. When asked about his injury, Dilios brushes it off, saying it is only an eye. Leonidas sees something more. He orders Dilios to leave, not as a retreat, but as a duty. He must return to Sparta and tell their story. Spread the legend of the 300. Let all of Greece know what happened here. Because Leonidas already understands the truth, they are not going to survive. Before sending him off, he entrusts Dilios with a personal task: return his wife's necklace back to her. The next day, Queen Gorgo stands before the council, her voice filled with urgency. She demands that Sparta send help. Her words begin to sway them until Thuron interrupts. He accuses her of betrayal. He claims she offered herself to him and that he refused, presenting himself as honorable. The accusation shocks the council. Guards move in, restraining her as she tries to defend herself. But once released, everything changes. In one swift motion, she grabs a blade and drives it straight into Thuron's body. As she pushes it deeper, she repeats his own words back to him, reminding him that it will not be quick or painless. As he collapses, the truth is exposed. A pouch falls from his robes, filled with Persian gold. The council finally sees him for what he is, a traitor. Back at the battlefield, the situation reaches its breaking point. The Arcadian allies withdraw, unable to continue the fight. Leonidas and his remaining Spartans are now completely surrounded. Xerxes returns one last time, offering surrender, and this time, Leonidas appears to accept. He removes his helmet, drops his shield, lowers his weapon, and slowly kneels. But it's not submission, it's strategy. In an instant, the Spartans launch their final assault. Chaos erupts. In the middle of it, Leonidas seizes the moment, grabbing his spear and hurling it straight at Xerxes. The blade strikes. It cuts his cheek. For the first time, the so-called god bleeds. Xerxes freezes, touching the wound, shaken by the realization that he is not invincible. But the moment passes. One by one, the Spartans fall. Even as death closes in, their resolve does not break. One soldier tells Leonidas it has been an honor to stand beside him. Leonidas answers quietly, it was an honor to live beside them. As he faces the rising sun, he speaks his final words, a whisper meant for someone far away. My love, then the sky darkens once more. A final wave of arrows descends, ensuring that none of them survive. Later, Dilios returns to Sparta. He delivers the necklace to Queen Gorgo and fulfills his mission, spreading the story of their sacrifice across Greece. The film closes 1 year later. Dilios now stands at the head of a massive army. Thousands of warriors line up behind him, far more than the 300 who stood before. This time, Sparta does not stand alone. And as they march toward battle, one thing is clear. The story of the 300 did not end at Thermopylae. It became the beginning of something far greater. Some movies tell you what they are within the first few minutes. 300 doesn't just tell you, it declares its identity with complete confidence. From the very first frame, the film makes it clear that it has no interest in presenting itself as a conventional historical epic. This is not a movie chasing realism. It is not trying to recreate ancient Greece with documentary precision. Instead, it aims for something more heightened, more stylized, more mythic. And that decision shapes the entire experience. What makes 300 stand out immediately is how different it looks from almost everything else. The film doesn't feel photographed in the traditional sense, it feels painted, sculpted. Designed, every frame appears as if it has been lifted from an illustrated world and then refined through a cinematic lens built on bronze tones, shadow, smoke, and stylized intensity. The skies don't look natural. The landscapes don't feel organic. Even the human form is pushed toward exaggeration. Everything becomes image, and that's exactly the intention. This film doesn't want to immerse you in history, it wants to immerse you in legend. That's why the visual identity matters so much. 300 is built on bold artificiality. The environments are carefully constructed, the colors are controlled with precision. The lighting transforms every scene into a dramatic composition. Even the texture of the film feels distinct. It carries a contrast where every surface seems polished, yet every moment still holds a sense of raw intensity. The result is a world that feels less like reality and more like memory or myths or a stylized retelling carved into moving images. And whether you connect with that approach or not, it's impossible to ignore how fully the film commits to its vision. This is where Zack Snyder's approach becomes essential, because 300 doesn't just have a visual style, it has a visual philosophy. The film understands that style here isn't decoration. Style is the experience itself. Its identity is built almost entirely through imagery, the way characters are framed, the way confrontations are lit, the way bodies are positioned, the way capes move through the air. The way a single glance or silhouette is treated like a moment of significance. Everything is elevated, everything is mythologized, even the color palette plays a crucial role. The film lives in shades of gold, bronze, black, deep red, and ash-tone gray. These colors don't just enhance appearance, they shape emotion. They create a mood that feels both ancient and dreamlike, both intense and strangely elegant. There's a constant sense that the film exists between beauty and conflict, between admiration and harshness. And that contrast is what makes the visual style so memorable. Because 300 is not beautiful in a soft or delicate way. It's visually striking in a bold, forceful way. It wants to leave an impression. It wants every frame to feel iconic, even if that means letting go of realism, restraint, or subtlety. That's why many viewers may forget specific plot details, but they remember exactly how the film looked. The bronze glow, the slow-motion bursts of action, the smoky skies, the sculptural presence of the Spartans, the towering shadows. The surreal opponents, the dreamlike cliffs, the storm-heavy atmosphere, a world that feels somewhere between a historical conflict and a living graphic mural. And that's because 300 was never designed to be casually watched. It was designed to leave a lasting imprint. Even the film's obvious digital construction works in its favor more often than not. The heavily stylized backgrounds don't try to convince you they're real. Instead, they become part of the visual language. The artificiality becomes the aesthetic. It gives the film a unique, almost theatrical quality, as if it exists somewhere between cinema, comic book art, and a vivid dream. That's why the phrase graphic novel brought to life is so often associated with this film. And in this case, it truly fits. Not because it simply copies comic panels, but because it understands how to translate exaggerated illustration into cinematic language. The frames are composed like artwork. The motion is designed like spectacle. The world feels created rather than discovered, and that gives the film an identity that is impossible to mistake. Of course, this approach comes with trade-offs. When a film is this focused on style, it risks becoming consumed by it. The more carefully refined every image becomes, the more the audience begins to notice the construction. And once that happens, some viewers may feel distance instead of immersion. They stop seeing a living world and start seeing a visual exercise. That criticism is valid, but even then, the ambition deserves recognition. Because 300 is not visually accidental. It's one of those films where every shot feels shaped and refined to fit a singular artistic vision. That level of consistency is rare. Many films are visually appealing, far fewer are visually authored, and this one absolutely feels authored. It may not be subtle, it may not be restrained, it may not align with traditional ideas of taste, but it is distinct. Unmistakably distinct. The kind of film where a single image is enough to tell you exactly what it is, and that is not a small achievement. In the end, the visual style of 300 is not just one of its strengths, it is the foundation of its entire legacy. Before the action, before the speeches, before the debates about substance versus spectacle, there is the look. That unforgettable, stylized, hyper-controlled identity that transforms the film from a simple war narrative into something closer to cinematic mythmaking. And that's why, years later, it still stands out. Not because it looked real, but because it looked like nothing else. There are directors who tell stories, and then there are directors who stage experiences. With 300, Zack Snyder isn't just directing a film, he's crafting a full sensory experience. Every decision, every movement, every frame feels pushed to its limit. This isn't passive filmmaking. It's deliberate. It's intense. It demands attention. From the very beginning, Snyder makes one thing clear. He's not here to simply interpret the material. He's here to amplify it. A director focused on impact. Snyder's approach is built on one core idea. Every moment should feel larger than life. A simple weapon swing becomes extended. A character turning their head is framed like a heroic reveal. A clash between forces becomes a slow-motion spectacle where every movement is given weight. This is a director who doesn't let moments pass. He holds on to them, extends them, elevates them, and when it works, it creates something undeniably powerful. There are sequences in 300 where Snyder's control over rhythm and imagery feels almost hypnotic. The camera doesn't just observe, it moves with purpose. It follows warriors through chaos, shifting between speed and stillness, turning combat into choreography. You're not just watching a confrontation. You're experiencing a carefully designed sequence of action. Control over rhythm and motion, one of Snyder's most defining tools here, is his manipulation of time. He accelerates moments. He slows them down. Then he snaps back to full speed, again and again. This technique gives the film its signature pulse. It creates a rhythm where action doesn't just occur, it lands with emphasis. Every movement feels intentional. Every impact feels deliberate. At its best, this makes the film feel almost musical, like a powerful symphony where movement and timing guide everything. But this is also where Snyder's approach becomes divisive. Because he doesn't use this technique occasionally, he uses it constantly, and that introduces a risk. When style becomes overload, Snyder's greatest strength, his commitment to style, is also where limitations begin to appear. Because when every moment is treated like a highlight, eventually, nothing stands out. The slow motion, the dramatic pauses, the stylized framing, it can start to blend together. What once felt powerful can gradually feel repetitive. What once felt intense can begin to feel so tightly controlled that it leans toward artificiality. It's not that the technique loses its effectiveness, it's that it rarely pauses. Zack Snyder doesn't give the film much space to breathe. He doesn't step back, he doesn't allow contrast to build naturally. And because of that, the film can feel like it exists in a constant state of escalation, with little room left to rise further. A director fully committed to vision, but here's the thing, whether you connect with it or not, you can't accuse Snyder of hesitation. There's no uncertainty in this film, no compromise, no safe middle ground. He knows exactly what kind of experience he's creating, and he commits to it completely. This isn't a director trying to appeal to everyone. This is a director fully leaning into his instincts. And that level of commitment gives 300-something many films struggle to achieve, a clear, unmistakable identity. Even its excess feels intentional. Even its weaknesses feel like extensions of its core vision. The comic book translation, a major part of Snyder's direction, also comes from how he translates the source material. Rather than reshaping the story into a conventional cinematic structure, he focuses on adapting the feeling of the graphic novel itself. The framing, the poses, the exaggerated movement, it all reflects a director trying to preserve not just the narrative, but the visual language of the original work. That's why characters often feel posed rather than natural. That's why scenes feel staged rather than spontaneous. That's why everything feels heightened, because Snyder isn't trying to make this feel realistic, he's trying to make it feel mythic. Audience engagement and sensory design, there's also a deliberate approach in how Snyder engages the audience. This film isn't built for quiet reflection, it's built for reaction. The camera moves closer, the edits land harder. The sound, the visuals, the motion, they all work together to create an immediate, instinctive response. It pulls you in, it encourages you to lean forward, to feel the energy. That's not accidental. Snyder understands that cinema isn't just about telling a story, it's about creating a sensory experience. And in 300, he pushes that idea as far as it can go. The balance that never quite happens, but for all its strengths, there's one thing Snyder doesn't fully achieve here: balance. The film rarely steps outside its own intensity. It rarely shifts tone in a meaningful way. It rarely allows quieter moments to deepen the experience. And because of that, the emotional impact doesn't always land as strongly as it could. The film keeps returning to the same notes: loud, powerful, forceful, but without variation, those notes gradually lose some of their weight. It's not a lack of skill, it's a lack of restraint. Final thought on Snyder's direction in the end: Zack Snyder's direction in 300 is impossible to ignore. It is bold, it is excessive, it is visually commanding. And at times it can feel overwhelming, but above everything else, it is distinct. This is a film where you can feel the director's presence in every frame. Every choice, every movement, every visual decision carries his signature. And whether you see that as brilliance or overindulgence, there's no denying one thing: Snyder didn't just direct 300, he left his imprint on it. If 300 has a heartbeat, it's in the battles. Everything else, the story, the characters, the politics, exists around them. But the battles, that's where the film truly comes alive, because this isn't just action, this is constructed intensity, carefully shaped, precisely controlled. Designed to hit you not just visually, but physically. War is choreography. Most war films aim for chaos. 300 takes a different approach. Here, combat is structured, almost elegant. Every movement feels intentional. Every clash has design. Every formation has purpose. The Spartans don't just fight, they move as a unit. Shields lock together, spears strike in rhythm, bodies fall in patterns that feel almost rehearsed. There's a discipline to the action that reflects the identity of the warriors themselves. And that's what makes these sequences stand out. You're not watching randomness, you're watching precision under pressure. The rhythm of combat, what truly elevates the action, is its rhythm. Zack Snyder doesn't just present confrontations, he controls their tempo. The film constantly shifts between speed and stillness. A charge begins at full intensity, then suddenly slow motion. A blade cuts through the air, the moment stretches, you feel the impact before it even arrives, then snap, back to real-time movement. This push and pull creates a cinematic rhythm that feels almost musical. It's not just about what happens, it's about when it happens and how long you experience it. At its best, this technique turns combat into something almost hypnotic. Frontline immersion, there are moments where the film pulls you directly into the center of the battlefield, not through realism, but through proximity. The camera moves with the warriors. It follows individual Spartans as they move through waves of opposition, shifting perspective from large-scale conflict to personal engagement within seconds. You don't feel like you're watching from a distance, you feel like you're right there, shield raised, breath heavy, energy colliding all around you. That sense of immersion is one of the film's strongest achievements. Stylization over realism, but make no mistake, this is not realistic warfare. This is myth-inspired combat. Opponents fall with dramatic weight, movements are exaggerated, the intensity is heightened, almost theatrical. The Spartans don't just endure, they dominate. They move through opposing forces with near-superhuman precision. Every strike connects, every motion feels deliberate, and that's where the film fully embraces its fantasy elements. This isn't about what war looked like, it's about what war feels like in legend. Spectacle and scale, the scale of these sequences adds another layer. You have massive forces advancing against a smaller, highly disciplined group. Waves of opposition pushing forward again and again. Unusual adversaries, masked warriors, towering figures, larger-than-life opponents, each encounter raising the visual intensity. And yet, despite the scale, the film rarely loses clarity. You always understand where the Spartans are. You always understand their formation. You always understand the flow of the encounter. That clarity is difficult to achieve, and it's one of the reasons these sequences remain so memorable. When it becomes repetition, but here's where things begin to shift. The same elements that make the battles impressive can also make them predictable over time. The rhythm stays consistent. The technique repeats. The structure doesn't evolve far beyond what you've already seen. Another wave, another slow motion strike, another stylized moment of impact, and gradually, what once felt exhilarating can start to feel familiar. Not weaker, just less surprising. Impact versus emotional weight. There's also something else missing beneath all the spectacle. The battles deliver strong visual impact, but not always emotional depth. You see the intensity. You feel the scale, but you don't always feel the cost. Because the characters are presented more as symbols than fully grounded individuals, the stakes remain largely visual. The film shows you what's happening, but doesn't always make you feel why it matters on a deeper level, and that creates a unique effect. You're impressed, but not always deeply moved. A new kind of action identity still. It's impossible to ignore what 300 achieved in terms of action design. These sequences didn't just entertain, they influenced. The slow motion-driven combat, the stylized presentation, the emphasis on visual rhythm over realism. All of it helped shape a new kind of action language that many later films would draw from, and that alone gives these sequences lasting importance. Final thought on the battles in the end. The battles in 300 are exactly what the film intends them to be. Bold, stylized, memorable, relentless. They are not grounded in realism. They are grounded in impact. And whether you experience them as thrilling or repetitive, there's no denying one thing. You haven't quite seen combat presented like this before. And that's why, even years later, these sequences remain the defining force behind 300. At the core of 300, beneath all the spectacle, all the intensity, all the visual force, there's a story. But it's a story that doesn't aim for complexity. It doesn't twist. It doesn't rely on surprises. It doesn't build itself around intricate subplots or layered narrative turns. Instead, it chooses a very different path. It simplifies itself into something almost myth-like in its structure. A story built on one idea strips everything away, and what remains is simple. A small group of warriors standing against an overwhelming force, fully aware of the outcome and choosing to face it anyway. That's it. And in many ways, that simplicity is intentional. 300 isn't trying to construct a complicated narrative. It's trying to tell a legend, and legends don't depend on complexity. They depend on clarity, on symbolism, on emotional immediacy. You don't analyze the structure of a legend in detail. You absorb it. Linear, direct, uncompromising. The storytelling moves in a straight line. There are no major detours. No intricate character arcs shaping the direction of events. No deeply layered political threads driving the narrative forward in a meaningful way. Even the subplot back in Sparta, while it adds context, never fully develops into something that reshapes the core story. It exists more as a parallel thread than a driving force. The film always returns to the same place, the battlefield, the stand, the inevitability of what's coming. And because of that, the story feels less like a journey and more like a steady march toward destiny. Myth over detail. This is where the film fully embraces its identity as an adaptation of Frank Miller's work. It's not focused on historical detail. It's not focused on realism. It's focused on myth-making. Everything is heightened. The opposition feels larger than life. The heroes feel almost superhuman. The conflict is absolute, clear, and direct without ambiguity. There are elements of betrayal, corruption, and sacrifice, but they aren't explored in depth. They appear as narrative moments rather than complex themes to be fully examined, because the film isn't asking questions. It's making declarations, substance or lack of it, and this is where the divide begins. For some viewers, the simplicity works. It gives the film focus. It keeps the narrative clean. It allows the spectacle to remain front and center without distraction. But for others, this simplicity can feel like emptiness. Because once the visual intensity fades, there isn't much underneath to hold on to. The story doesn't evolve. The ideas don't deepen. The narrative doesn't expand beyond its central premise. It becomes clear that the film isn't building towards something new. It's reinforcing the same idea again and again. Moments that hint at more. What makes this more noticeable is that there are moments where the film almost reaches for something deeper. Themes of sacrifice, questions of leadership, the cost of conflict, the idea of legacy, they're all present briefly, but the film never stays with them long enough to develop them into something substantial. It touches on depth and then moves on, as if it's more interested in the image of meaning than fully exploring it. A story designed to support spectacle ultimately, the story in 300 serves a very specific purpose. It supports the experience, it gives context to the battles, it provides a framework for the visuals, it creates a sense of purpose behind the action, but it never tries to compete with the spectacle, and that's a deliberate choice. Because in this film, the story isn't the main attraction. It's the foundation everything else stands on. Final thought on the story in the end, the narrative of 300 is both its strength and its limitation. Its simplicity gives it clarity. But that same simplicity limits its emotional and intellectual depth. It works as a legend. It works as a visual myth. It works as a story you can follow effortlessly. But if you're looking for complexity, for deeper exploration, for something that evolves beyond its premise, you may find yourself wanting more, because it doesn't aim to tell a complex story. It tells a bold, simple one and lets the visuals carry everything else. Pacing, momentum, and structural repetition on paper, 300 should feel fast. Constant battles, relentless energy. High-stakes conflict from beginning to end. But in practice, the pacing creates a different experience, because this is not a film driven by narrative momentum. It's driven by visual rhythm. And that leads to a very specific kind of flow. The illusion of speed. At first, the film feels intense. The energy is high. The visuals are striking. The battles arrive in waves. But as it continues, something subtle begins to emerge. You start to notice the pattern. A speech, a build-up, a battle, slow motion, a heroic pose, repeat. The structure doesn't evolve far beyond this cycle. And once that rhythm becomes familiar, the film can feel less like it's moving forward and more like it's revisiting the same idea. High impact, limited progression, each individual moment can be powerful. A sequence may look visually stunning. A speech may stay in your memory. A single frame may feel iconic. But the film struggles to build those moments into something that continuously develops. Instead of escalation, you get variation. Another battle, but slightly larger. Another opponent, but slightly different. Another moment presented in a new visual way. And while that keeps things visually engaging, it doesn't always create a strong sense of narrative progression. The role of slow motion, a significant part of this pacing, comes from the film's use of slow motion. It stretches time, it emphasizes impact, it allows every detail to be absorbed, but when used repeatedly, it begins to affect momentum. Moments that should feel fast feel extended, sequences that should feel urgent feel controlled. And over time, that shifts the overall flow. Instead of building tension, the film often pauses it. Uneven rhythm between action and downtime. Another challenge lies in how the film handles quieter moments. Between battles, the pace slows, but not always in a way that adds depth. These scenes don't consistently introduce new insights, emotional development, or meaningful progression. Instead, they often feel like brief transitions before the next major sequence, and because of that, they can feel less impactful. So you're left with two extremes: highly stylized, intense action, and slower, less engaging transitions. But not enough variation in between to create balance. Repetition versus reinforcement. To be fair, this repetition is partly intentional. The film reinforces its themes: strength, endurance, defiance, through repetition. It shows the Spartans holding their ground again and again, refusing to yield. But there's a fine line between reinforcement and redundancy, and at times, 300 crosses that line. What begins as powerful becomes predictable. What feels intense becomes expected. Does it carry you or lose you? This is where the audience experience begins to divide. Some viewers are drawn into the rhythm. They enjoy the repetition. They embrace the film's commitment to its style and structure. Others begin to feel its weight. They notice the lack of progression. They feel certain sections slow down. They begin to disengage, not because the film becomes quiet, but because it doesn't change enough. Final thought on pacing. In the end, the pacing reflects the film itself. Bold, stylized, relentless, but not always balanced. It delivers powerful moments, but struggles to connect them into a continuously evolving experience. It moves forward, but often in familiar steps. and that leaves you with something that can feel both intense and, at times, repetitive. Because here, momentum isn't about where the story goes, it's about how the same idea is presented again and again. In most great films, the story draws you in, but it's the characters that make you stay. They give the conflict weight, they give the outcome meaning, they turn spectacle into something personal. And this is exactly where 300 takes a very different approach, because this is not a film built on character depth, it's a film built on character symbolism. Heroes as symbols, not people from the moment you meet them. The Spartans aren't introduced as deeply layered individuals. They are introduced as ideas: strength, discipline, honor, defiance. Each character represents something larger than themselves, and while that aligns with the film's mythic tone, it also creates a sense of distance. These aren't people you come to know closely, they're figures you're meant to admire. Take Leonidas, portrayed by Gerard Butler. He is powerful, commanding, charismatic, but he is also fixed. He doesn't evolve in the traditional sense. He doesn't question his path. He doesn't undergo an internal shift. He begins as a symbol of defiance and ends as that same symbol, just amplified, more intense, and closer to legend. The absence of character arcs, and that's a key point. Most narratives rely on transformation. Characters grow, they struggle, they fail, they learn. In 300, that kind of progression is minimal. The Spartans don't become something new, they reinforce what they already are. The film isn't interested in who they might become, it's interested in proving who they already are. And because of that, the emotional journey feels limited. You're not watching transformation, you're watching confirmation. Emotional distance in a story about sacrifice, this becomes more noticeable in the film's most significant moments, moments of sacrifice, loss, and final stand. These are scenes that should feel heavy, they should feel impactful, they should carry emotional weight, and visually they do, but emotionally, that connection isn't always fully there. Because the film doesn't spend enough time building intimacy with its characters. You understand their purpose, you respect their resolve, but you don't always feel deeply connected to them as individuals. The stakes are clear, but not always personal. The collective over the individual. One way to look at this is that the film isn't trying to tell the story of individuals, it's telling the story of a people. The Spartans are presented as a unified identity, a culture, a mindset, a way of life, and in that sense, the lack of individual depth becomes part of the design. This isn't about one person's journey, it's about a collective stand. And by the end, you do understand that identity, what they represent, what they value, what they're willing to stand for. But understanding is not the same as emotional connection. Supporting characters and missed opportunities, there are moments where the film hints at something deeper. Lena Headey's Queen Gorgo brings a different perspective, political, emotional, grounded. Her storyline suggests complexity. Internal tension, the cost of leadership beyond the battlefield, but that thread never fully develops into something that reshapes the emotional core. Other characters, captains, soldiers, allies, have presence but not progression. They serve the story but don't expand it. Even Rodrigo Santoro's Xerxes, despite being visually unforgettable, functions more as a symbolic opposing force than a fully explored character. He represents excess, power, domination, but rarely moves beyond that. Stakes without vulnerability. What gives stakes real emotional power is vulnerability, the sense that something can be lost, that someone can break, that outcomes are uncertain. In 300, the stakes are massive, but vulnerability is limited. The Spartans are portrayed as nearly unstoppable, almost mythic in their strength, both physical and mental. They don't tire, they don't falter. They don't hesitate, and while that enhances the legend, it reduces tension. Because when characters feel invincible, the sense of danger feels less immediate. Admiration versus connection, this creates a distinct emotional dynamic. You admire the characters, you respect them, you're impressed by them, but you don't always connect with them, and there's a difference. Connection comes from seeing humanity, flaws, doubts, fears. Admiration comes from witnessing strength. 300 chooses admiration, and that choice shapes the entire emotional experience. Does it still work? For some viewers, yes, because the film isn't trying to make you feel sorrow in a traditional sense, it's trying to create awe. It wants you to feel energized, engaged, and overwhelmed, not necessarily emotionally grounded. And in that context, the lack of character depth becomes less of a flaw and more of a trade-off. Final thought on characterization. In the end, 300 doesn't build its impact through character complexity. It builds it through presence, through symbolism, through myth. The characters aren't designed to feel real. They're designed to feel larger than life. And whether that works for you depends on what you're looking for. If you want layered personalities and emotional evolution, you may find the film distant. But if you accept characters as icons, as embodiments of an idea, then the film delivers exactly what it promises. not people, but legends. In a film like 300, performances don't operate in the usual way. This isn't a movie where actors disappear into deeply layered roles. This is a movie where actors are asked to become icons. They don't just act, they project, and that distinction changes everything. Performance as presence. The cast isn't built around subtlety. It's built around physical authority, vocal intensity, and visual impact. Every actor becomes part of a larger composition, framed, lit, and directed to feel larger than life. Dialogue is delivered like a declaration. Movement is controlled like choreography. Even silence feels intentional. This is performance as presence, and within that framework, certain performances stand out. Gerard Butler as Leonidas at the center is Gerard Butler. His portrayal of King Leonidas doesn't rely on nuance, it relies on force. His voice, posture, and physical presence are all designed to command attention. He doesn't question, he declares. He doesn't hesitate, he confronts, and that works perfectly within the film's tone. This isn't a character meant to feel fragile or conflicted. This is a leader meant to feel unbreakable. Butler fully embraces that idea, delivering lines with a theatrical intensity that turns them into memorable moments. You remember how he speaks, how he stands, how he dominates the frame. And in a film like this, that's exactly what matters. Supporting performances, strength within limitation. The supporting cast operates within the same structure, but with less room to dominate. Lena Headey brings a grounded presence to Queen Gorgo. While much of the film leans into heightened masculinity, her performance introduces a different kind of strength, measured, controlled, and political. She adds weight to scenes that might otherwise feel transitional. Dominic West introduces tension into the political subplot, bringing a sense of manipulation and unease. His performance hints at complexity, even when the script doesn't fully explore it. Then there's Rodrigo Santoro as Xerxes. Visually, he is one of the most striking elements in the film. His portrayal isn't grounded, it's theatrical, surreal, almost otherworldly. His voice, his transformation, his presence, it all contributes to a character that feels less like a person and more like a symbol of excess and control. He's not meant to be relatable, he's meant to feel imposing, and in that sense, the performance succeeds. The ensemble effect beyond the central performances, the rest of the cast blends into a unified identity. The Spartans are not defined by individual personalities, they are defined by collective presence. Strong, disciplined, visually uniform, they function almost as a single entity, and that's entirely intentional. The film isn't interested in separating them into clearly distinct individuals. It wants them to feel like a force, a wall of bodies, a unified will, and the casting reflects that. Every actor fits the physical and tonal demands of that vision. They may not stand apart in highly individual ways, but together, they create something powerful. The limits of the material, but here's the challenge. No matter how committed the performances are, they're still working within a script that doesn't offer much emotional range. There are no deeply layered internal conflicts to explore, no complex relationships driving the narrative, no transformative arcs that allow the cast to show real progression. So the performances remain largely fixed, not because the actors lack ability, but because the film doesn't ask for more. Style over subtlety. This is where 300 makes a very clear choice. It doesn't prioritize subtle acting. It prioritizes impactful delivery. Lines are spoken with force. Emotions are expressed broadly. Moments are heightened rather than understated. And within that approach, the performances work. But it also means that if you're looking for layered, emotionally intricate acting, this isn't the film that provides it. Memorability versus depth. What 300 does achieve, however, is memorability. You may not remember intricate character details, but you remember the presence. You remember Leonidas standing against impossible odds. You remember Xerxes towering with an almost godlike aura. You remember the intensity in the voices, the weight in the delivery, the physical dominance of every frame. These performances don't stay with you because of emotional depth. They stay with you because of visual and vocal force. Final thought on performances. In the end, the performances in 300 are perfectly aligned with the film's identity. They are bold, they are theatrical, they are larger than life. They do not aim to make the characters feel ordinary, they aim to make them feel legendary. And whether that works for you depends on what you expect from a performance. If you want nuance and transformation, you may find it limited. But if you're looking for presence, power, and unforgettable delivery, then 300 gives you exactly that. Because in this film, acting isn't about becoming someone else. It's about becoming something larger than life. In a film like 300, words don't just carry meaning, they carry weight. Not emotional weight in the traditional sense, but mythic weight. Because the dialogue in this film isn't written to sound natural, it's written to sound legendary. language built for impact from the very first lines. You can tell this isn't everyday speech. Characters don't simply talk, they declare. They don't casually converse, they proclaim. Every sentence feels sharpened. Every phrase feels shaped to land with force. This is dialogue designed for echo, for repetition, for memory. Lines are delivered as if they are meant to be carved into stone rather than spoken in passing. And that's why so many of them stay with you. The power of iconic lines, some of the film's most memorable moments come entirely from how its lines are delivered. Statements of defiance, declarations of conflict, speeches about honor and sacrifice. They're not subtle, they're not deeply layered, but they are effective, because within the film's heightened world, this style of dialogue feels appropriate. It matches the scale, it matches the tone, it matches the exaggerated reality the film is operating in. It doesn't try to ground the story, it tries to elevate it. When writing becomes one note, but that same strength also becomes a limitation. Because the film rarely steps outside this tone, almost every line exists within the same emotional register: forceful, proud, defiant, intense. There's very little variation, very little softness, very little vulnerability, very little quiet reflection, and over time, that lack of contrast becomes noticeable. What begins as powerful can start to feel repetitive. Moments of weakness. There are also stretches where the writing doesn't hold up as strongly. Some lines feel overly constructed, almost as if they're working too hard to sound important. Others come across as simplistic, especially when the film leans too heavily into macho posturing without adding a new layer. And because the characters themselves are not deeply developed, the dialogue often has to carry more than it can fully support. It tells you what to feel, instead of always letting you discover it for yourself. Narration and mythic framing. Then there's the narration, an essential part of how the film presents itself. The story is framed like a legend being retold after the fact. That gives everything a sense of grandeur, inevitability, and history transformed into myth. The narration helps guide the audience. It adds context, it reinforces the tone, but it also comes with a trade-off. At times, it feels like the film is explaining too much. Instead of allowing moments to stand on their own, the narration steps in to underline them, to shape how they should be understood. And while that fits the storytelling style of a graphic novel adaptation, it can reduce the sense of discovery. You are being told the story rather than fully living it as it unfolds. Faithfulness to source material. A major reason for this writing style comes from its roots in Frank Miller's graphic novel. The dialogue reflects that origin. It's stylized, it's exaggerated. It's built around bold, striking lines rather than natural conversation. And in that context, it works. The film isn't trying to transform the material into something more grounded. It's trying to preserve its identity, even if that means stepping away from realism in the process. Style versus substance in writing. Ultimately, the writing in 300 follows the same pattern as the rest of the film. It prioritizes style over depth. It aims to impress, to energize, to create moments that feel powerful on their own, even if they do not always build into something deeper. There are flashes of sharpness. Moments where the dialogue lands exactly where it needs to, but they exist within a script that rarely moves beyond its core tone. Final thought on dialogue and writing. In the end, the writing of 300 is not subtle, not nuanced, and not especially complex. But it is deliberate. It knows what it wants to be. It knows the tone it's aiming for, and it commits to that identity fully. The dialogue doesn't try to sound real, it tries to sound timeless. And whether that feels powerful or excessive depends entirely on how willing you are to embrace the film's mythic voice. Because in 300, words aren't there to reflect reality, they're there to build legend. If 300 has a soul, it lives in the image, not the story, not the dialogue, not even the performances. It's the visual construction of every single frame that defines this film. Because this isn't just cinematography in the traditional sense, this is image design pushed to its most forceful form. Every frame feels engineered from the very beginning. You notice something unusual. Nothing looks accidental. Every shot feels placed. Every angle feels calculated. Every composition feels constructed, not simply captured. This isn't a camera observing reality, it's a camera shaping it. Characters are framed like statues. Landscapes are arranged like paintings. Even moments of conflict are composed with a kind of visual symmetry. It's not just about what you're seeing, it's about how deliberately it's being presented. The power of composition. There's a constant emphasis on strong, iconic framing. Low angles make warriors appear towering and unstoppable. Wide shots isolate small figures against vast, surreal environments. Centered compositions turn characters into symbols rather than individuals. Everything is designed to feel heroic or imposing or mythic, and that's the key. This film doesn't frame people as people. It frames them as images you're meant to remember. A color palette with identity, then there's the color. 300 doesn't just use color, it controls it. The palette is limited, but incredibly intentional. Bronze tones dominate the world. Deep blacks create contrast and shadow. Crimson reds cut through the frame during moments of intense action. Muted golds and grays give everything a sense of age and myth. It's a world that feels both ancient and surreal at the same time, and that restriction in color becomes a strength because it creates consistency, a unified visual tone that makes the film instantly recognizable. You don't need to see the characters. You don't need to hear the dialogue. One frame, and you know exactly what you're watching. Lighting as atmosphere lighting plays a major role in shaping that identity. This isn't natural lighting, it's dramatic lighting. Shadows are deep and pronounced. Highlights are sharp and controlled. Faces are often partially lit, emphasizing intensity and mood. The battlefield is rarely bright or clear, it's smoky. It's hazy, it feels like it exists somewhere between reality and imagination. And that creates a kind of visual tension, a constant sense that you're not just watching events unfold, you're watching a carefully constructed vision of them. Digital enhancement and stylization, much of this comes from the extensive use of digital techniques. The environments are often built rather than discovered. Backgrounds are refined, textures are enhanced. And instead of hiding that, the film embraces it. The artificiality becomes part of the aesthetic. It's not trying to look realistic, it's trying to look perfectly stylized. That's why the world feels so distinctive. It's not bound by natural limitations. It exists somewhere between cinema, painting, and graphic illustration. Movement within the frame, even when the camera remains still, the image feels alive. Capes move with dramatic flow. Dust lingers in the air. Action unfolds in exaggerated arcs. Bodies fall with choreographed precision. And when the camera does move, it does so with purpose. It glides, it tracks. It follows motion in a way that enhances composition rather than disrupting it. Nothing feels accidental. Everything feels designed to be seen. Iconic visual moments. This is why the film creates so many memorable images. A warrior standing alone against an overwhelming force. Figures falling in slow motion against a glowing sky. A king framed like a monument rather than a man. These moments don't just happen, they're carefully crafted to stay with you. And they succeed, because even if the details of the story fade, the visuals remain. Beauty versus overindulgence, but like everything in 300, this level of control comes with a trade-off. When every frame is this refined, this intentional, this stylized, it can begin to feel overwhelming. There's very little contrast, very little simplicity, very little restraint, and over time, that can create a sense of visual fatigue. Because when everything is intense, nothing feels grounded. Final thought on cinematography. In the end, the cinematography of 300 is one of its defining strengths. It's bold, it's controlled, it's unmistakable. It transforms the film from a simple war narrative into something closer to visual mythology. But it also raises a question. When every image is treated like a masterpiece, does the film gain power or lose balance? That answer depends on the viewer, but one thing is certain. This is not a film you watch and forget. It's a film you see and remember. If the visuals define the identity of 300, then the technical craftsmanship is what makes that identity possible. Because nothing here exists by accident. Every background, every weapon, every scar, every drop of stylized impact, every piece of armor, it's all been designed, constructed, and refined to serve one goal: to turn this world into a living myth. A world built, not found. Unlike traditional historical films that rely on real locations, this film builds almost everything from the ground up. The landscapes are digitally created. The skies are shaped and enhanced. The environments are sculpted through visual effects, and the film doesn't try to conceal that. In fact, it embraces it. This isn't about making the world feel realistic in a conventional sense. It's about making it visually consistent with the film's stylized vision. The result is a setting that feels less like a place and more like a constructed realm of legend. CGI is style, not illusion. The digital effects aren't designed to deceive. You can recognize what's enhanced. You can see the stylization, but that's intentional. Because instead of aiming for invisible realism, the film uses these tools creatively to expand scale, shape atmosphere, and push reality into something more dramatic. Stormy skies feel heavier. Battlegrounds feel more surreal. The world feels heightened, almost dreamlike. It's not realism, it's visual expression. The power of physical detail. While digital elements shape the environment, the physical design brings it to life. Costumes play a major role. Spartan armor, minimal, functional, iconic. Capes flowing, dramatic, always catching the light. Weapons clean, sharp, visually striking. Every piece feels intentional. Nothing appears random. Nothing feels generic. Even the smallest details, marks on shields, textures on leather, patterns on armor, add to the sense that this world has been carefully constructed. Makeup and character design, then there's the makeup and character design. This is where the film leans further into its stylized identity. The Spartans are presented almost like sculptures, physically defined, enhanced through lighting and visual techniques. Their appearance isn't just physical, it's symbolic: strength, precision, discipline. On the other side, the opposing forces are designed to feel unfamiliar, exaggerated, almost otherworldly: piercings, chains, distorted features, unnatural proportions. They're not just adversaries, they're visual contrasts. The design makes it immediately clear who belongs to which side, not just through the story, but through appearance alone. Creatures and fantasy elements. The film also introduces creatures and heightened elements that push it even further away from realism. Massive beasts, masked warriors, unusual, exaggerated figures. These designs aren't meant to be historically accurate, they're meant to be visually striking. And in that sense, they succeed. Each new opponent feels like a new visual challenge, adding variety to the encounters and reinforcing the film's mythic tone. Stylized impact and digital enhancement. Even the moments of impact are enhanced through visual effects. Nothing is presented in a raw or grounded way. Instead, everything is controlled, stylized, and shaped to match the film's aesthetic. Movements are emphasized, impacts are extended. Every detail is designed to be seen and felt. This isn't realism, it's crafted intensity. The technical work transforms these moments into something almost artistic, aligning them with the film's overall visual language rather than grounding them in reality. When detail becomes excess, but like every other element in 300, this level of detail comes with a trade-off. When everything is enhanced, everything is polished, everything is stylized, it can begin to feel overwhelming. There's very little contrast between natural and constructed elements, very little restraint in how effects are applied, and for some viewers, that creates distance. Instead of feeling immersed in the world, they become aware of how carefully it's been built. A unified visual language. What the film does exceptionally well, however, is consistency. Every element, digital effects, costumes, makeup, production design, works together. There's no clash of styles. No moment where something feels out of place. Everything belongs to the same visual language, and that's what gives the film its cohesion, even at its most exaggerated. Final thought on technical design. In the end, the technical work in 300 isn't just impressive, it's essential. Without it, the film wouldn't exist in the same way. The digital design builds the world. The costumes define identity. The makeup shapes presence. The effects enhance impact. Together, they create something that goes beyond traditional filmmaking. Not realism, not pure fantasy, but something in between. A world that doesn't exist, but feels intentionally crafted to be remembered. If the visuals define the identity of 300, then the sound is what gives it force. Because this film doesn't just want to be seen, it wants to be felt. A score that drives intensity. The music, composed by Tyler Bates, isn't subtle. It doesn't sit quietly in the background. It pushes forward constantly. Heavy percussion, driving rhythms, layered vocals, dark metallic tones. It feels intense, relentless, designed to match the film's visual energy. This isn't a score that gently supports emotion. It amplifies everything. A speech becomes more powerful. A battle becomes heavier. A moment of tension becomes overwhelming. The music doesn't follow the scene, it drives it. Sound as momentum. What makes the soundtrack effective is how closely it connects to the film's rhythm. When action builds, the music rises. When motion slows, the score stretches. When intensity peaks, the sound surges with it. It creates a sense of forward motion, even when the narrative itself isn't progressing, and that's important. Because in a film where story depth is limited, the sound design helps maintain engagement. It keeps the experience active, even when the structure begins to feel repetitive. The physical impact of sound. There's also a physical quality to how the film uses sound. You don't just hear the clashes, you feel them. Metal meets metal with weight, shields connect with force, voices carry power. The sound design makes every action feel larger than life, and combined with the score, it creates a sensory intensity that pulls you in, whether you expect it or not. Voice, echo, and powered dialogue is also shaped by its sound design. Voices aren't simply spoken, they're projected. They carry echo, depth, and presence. When Lena speaks, it doesn't feel like a casual exchange, it feels like a command. That vocal intensity, combined with the score, gives even simple lines a sense of importance. It turns words into moments. Sensory intensity. As design at a certain point, something becomes clear. 300 isn't just a visual experience, it's a full sensory construction. The music, the sound effects, the editing, the pacing, everything works together to create a constant state of stimulation. there's very little quiet. Very little stillness, very little space. The film aims to keep you engaged at all times, and for a while it succeeds. When sound becomes saturation, but like the visuals, the sound design can become overwhelming. When every moment is loud, every scene is intense, every beat is pushed to its peak, it begins to lose variation. The impact starts to level out, the intensity becomes expected. And without quieter moments to balance it, the experience can feel exhausting rather than immersive. Music as identity still, there's no denying how much the soundtrack contributes to the film's identity. If you remove the music, the film becomes something very different, less powerful, less immediate, less immersive. The score doesn't just support the film, it defines its energy. It gives the film its pulse, its drive, its rhythm. Final thought on sound and music in the end. The music and sound design do exactly what the film intends. They amplify everything. The action feels larger, the moments feel heavier, the experience feels more intense. But like the visuals, that intensity comes with a cost, because when every second is designed to hit hard, you eventually stop feeling the difference between impact and excess. Still, when it works, it works. Because this isn't a film that simply plays in front of you, it surrounds you. One of the biggest discussions around 300 isn't about its action, or its visuals, or even its performances. It's about one central question. What is this film actually trying to be? Not history, but interpretation. At first glance. 300 presents itself like a historical epic. Ancient Greece, Spartans, a massive invasion, the Battle of Thermopylae. All the elements are there, but very quickly the film makes one thing clear. This is not history as it happened. This is history reimagined, exaggerated, and stylized through the lens of Frank Miller's graphic novel. And that distinction matters, because the film isn't trying to recreate the past. It's trying to recreate a version of the past, one shaped by myth, symbolism, and artistic interpretation. Faithful to the source material in terms of adaptation, the film stays remarkably close to its source. The visual style, the exaggerated characters, the heightened presentation of conflict, the dramatic poses and compositions. All of it reflects the identity of the original graphic novel. This isn't a loose adaptation, it's a translation. Frame by frame, tone by tone, the film mirrors the look and feel of Miller's work. It captures not just the story, but the visual language behind it. And for those familiar with the source, that level of faithfulness is a major strength, because what they're seeing isn't a reinterpretation. It's the original vision brought into motion, where accuracy shifts, but that same faithfulness comes with a trade-off. The more the film leans into its graphic novel roots, the further it moves from historical reality. Events are amplified. Characters are heightened. Opponents are portrayed in ways that feel surreal, sometimes even fantastical. This isn't simple dramatization, it's stylized reinterpretation. And for viewers expecting a grounded historical account, that can feel misleading. Because what's being presented isn't a precise depiction of history, it's a mythologized version of it. Myth versus reality, but here's the key idea. 300 isn't focused on reality, it's focused on legend. The kind of story passed down through generations, the kind of story where facts evolve through perspective, where heroes become larger than life, where opponents become symbolic. In that sense, the film isn't trying to teach history, it's trying to capture the feeling of a story that has already been shaped into myth. The impact of interpretation, however, this approach raises important questions, because when history is stylized this heavily, it becomes more than entertainment, it becomes interpretation, and interpretation carries influence. The way characters are portrayed, the way cultures are depicted, the way conflict is framed, all of it shapes how the audience understands the story, and in 300 that portrayal is not neutral. The Spartans are idealized, strong, disciplined, heroic. Their opponents are exaggerated, unfamiliar, excessive, almost surreal. The contrast is clear, and while it aligns with the graphic novel's style, it also creates a version of events that can feel one-sided. Artistic freedom versus responsibility, so where does that leave the film? On one side, it is a highly faithful adaptation of its source material. It delivers exactly what it sets out to do, translate a graphic novel into a cinematic experience with bold visual consistency. On the other side, it draws from real historical events, and that means its interpretation carries weight beyond pure fiction. That's where the tension lies. How much creative freedom should a film have when it draws from history? At what point does stylization begin to reshape understanding? The film doesn't answer those questions. It simply commits to its approach and leaves the interpretation to the audience. A story told through a lens. One way to understand the film is to see it as a story told from a specific perspective, not an objective account, but a subjective retelling, a version shaped by bias, pride, and myth-making. And if you view it that way, the exaggeration begins to make sense, because you're not watching history unfold. You're watching history as it has been remembered, retold, and reshaped over time. Final thought on accuracy Vs. Adaptation in the end, 300 isn't a historical film in the traditional sense. It's a visual myth inspired by history. It trades accuracy for style. It replaces realism with impact. It chooses loyalty to its source over strict alignment with the past. And whether that works for you depends on what you expect. If you're looking for a factual retelling, this isn't it. But if you accept it as a stylized interpretation, a legend brought to life through bold, exaggerated imagery, then it becomes exactly what it intends to be, not a record of what happened, but a vision of how it's remembered. If there's one element that defines 300 more than anything else, it's not the story, it's not the characters, it's how conflict is presented, because this isn't conflict as chaos, this is conflict as design. Conflict as visual language. From the very first clash, the film establishes its approach. Every strike matters. Every impact is emphasized. Every moment of intensity is shaped into an image. Movements don't just happen, they're extended. Bodies don't just fall, they move with choreographed precision. Impacts don't just occur, they're framed like visual events. This isn't meant to feel realistic, it's meant to feel mythic. The signature slow motion at the center of this style is the film's most recognizable technique, slow motion. Time stretches, moments expand, a single movement becomes an event. Zack Snyder uses slow motion to control how the audience experiences each moment. Instead of reacting instantly, you're guided to absorb every detail. You see the arc of movement. You see the tension in the body. You see the exact point of contact. Then suddenly, everything returns to full speed, and that contrast creates intensity. At its best, it's powerful. It transforms action into something almost poetic. A choreographed experience, this is where the film becomes distinctive. The battles aren't just confrontations, they're performances. Movements carry rhythm, strikes follow timing. The camera follows motion as if it's part of a coordinated sequence. It feels like a form of visual choreography, and there are moments where this approach genuinely works. Moments where the film finds beauty, not in what's happening, but in how it's being presented. Excess as identity, but here's the shift. The film doesn't use this style occasionally. It uses it constantly. Slow motion becomes the default. Stylization becomes the rule, and over time, that consistency changes how the film feels. What begins as striking becomes familiar. What feels intense becomes expected. When impact turns into repetition, because when every moment is treated as a highlight, nothing stands out anymore. Another slow motion sequence, another stylized impact, another visually emphasized moment. The technique doesn't lose its quality, but it loses its surprise. And without surprise, intensity begins to fade. Emotional distance through stylization, there's also a deeper effect. The more the film stylizes conflict, the less it feels grounded. And when it doesn't feel grounded, it doesn't carry the same emotional weight. You see what's happening. You recognize the craftsmanship, but you don't always feel the consequences. Impact becomes image, outcome becomes spectacle, and that creates distance, designed intensity versus raw experience. Compare this to more grounded war films, where conflict feels chaotic, messy, and unpredictable. In 300, everything is controlled, every movement is clean, every action is precise, every moment is framed. It's not about showing what conflict looks like in reality. It's about showing what it looks like when it's transformed into legend. The appeal of hyperstylization, and to be fair, that's exactly why it works for so many viewers. This level of stylization makes the film exciting. It makes it memorable. It makes it distinct. It transforms intensity into something almost like cinematic art. For many, that's the appeal. It's what gives the film its identity. The cost of going too far, but there's always a trade-off. The more the film leans into style, the more it risks losing substance. The more it emphasizes spectacle, the more it distances itself from emotional reality. And eventually the question becomes, are you feeling the impact or simply observing it? Final thought on conflict and style in the end, the way 300 presents conflict isn't meant to unsettle. It's meant to impress. It's controlled. It's choreographed. It's elevated into something almost unreal. And that's what makes it unforgettable. But it's also what makes it divisive. Because the film doesn't just present conflict, it transforms it into spectacle. And whether that feels powerful or excessive depends entirely on how you respond to that transformation. At its core, 300 isn't really about war. It's about what war represents. It's about identity, about belief, about the kind of people who choose to stand even when they know the outcome. And everything in this film, every line, every battle, every image, feeds into one central idea. What does it mean to be a Spartan? Heroism as defiance in this world. Heroism isn't quiet, it's not reflective, it's not uncertain, it's loud, it's absolute, it's defiant. The Spartans don't fight because they expect victory. They stand because they believe the act of standing itself matters. That's what defines their heroism. Not triumph, but refusal. They don't retreat, they don't negotiate, they don't hesitate. And in the film's language, that unwavering stance becomes something larger than strategy. It becomes legend. Sacrifice as purpose. Sacrifice here is not framed as tragedy, it's framed as purpose. From the very beginning, the film presents the idea of giving everything in battle as something meaningful, a necessary cost, a defining end. The Spartans don't fear it, they anticipate it, and more importantly, they accept it. This shifts the emotional tone of the entire story, because instead of asking, will they survive, the film asks, will they endure long enough to matter? That's a different kind of stake. It's not about escape, it's about legacy. Masculinity amplified. Then there's the most visible theme running throughout the film, masculinity, but not in a subtle or layered way. This is masculinity presented at full intensity: strength, endurance, aggression, discipline. Physical precision. Every Spartan is shown as the idealized warrior form, controlled, powerful, unyielding. Their voices are strong, their movements are deliberate, their focus is singular. This isn't just characterization. It's visual ideology. The film doesn't just present masculinity, it celebrates it. The Spartan identity. All of this builds toward the idea of Spartan identity. The Spartans are not defined first as individuals, they are defined as part of a system, a culture that shapes them from the beginning, a way of life centered on strength, loyalty, and commitment to the state. Weakness is rejected. Fear is dismissed, honor is everything, and the film presents this identity with near-complete admiration. There's very little questioning, very little critique. The Spartan way isn't examined, it's declared. Unity over individuality. This is why the film emphasizes the group over the individual. The Spartans move together, fight together, stand together. Even their personalities feel aligned. This isn't about personal journeys. It's about collective purpose, and by the end, you don't just recognize them as characters, you recognize them as a symbol of a people. The power of simplicity. The themes in 300 are not complex. They are direct, they are bold. They are repeated consistently, and that repetition is intentional, because the film isn't trying to explore these ideas in depth, it's trying to reinforce them. Every confrontation reinforces courage. Every speech reinforces honor. Every act reinforces legacy. It becomes a loop of the same message, delivered with increasing intensity. The limits of a narrow perspective, but this approach also creates limitations. Because the film's focus is so narrow, it leaves little room for alternative perspectives. There's no meaningful questioning of the Spartan ideology, no exploration of its drawbacks, no deeper examination of what that way of life costs beyond the battlefield. Everything is framed through admiration, and that makes the themes feel powerful, but also one-dimensional. Inspiration versus idealization. This leads to an important distinction. Is the film inspiring, or is it idealizing? Because there's a difference. Inspiration comes from complexity, from seeing both strength and struggle. Idealization comes from presenting something as flawless. 300 leans strongly toward idealization. It shows you what the Spartans are, but not what they lack. Final thought on themes. In the end, the film builds itself around a clear set of ideas. Heroism as defiance, sacrifice as purpose, masculinity as strength, identity as unity. It doesn't question these ideas, it reinforces them, and that's what gives the film its impact, but it's also what limits it. Because while those themes are bold, they are also narrow, and whether that feels motivating or excessive depends entirely on how you respond to the world the film is creating. Because in this film, these aren't just themes. They are the foundation of everything. For a film that presents itself as a stylized myth, it has sparked very real discussions. Because once the spectacle fades, once the heightened motion settles, one question begins to emerge. What is this film actually expressing, more than just entertainment? On the surface, 300 appears as pure entertainment, a story of warriors, a stand against overwhelming odds, a visually driven experience rooted in legend. But the way that story is framed, the way characters are presented, the way conflict is defined, opens the door to deeper interpretation. A clear divide, heroes versus the other. The Spartans are shown as disciplined, honorable, physically refined. They are structured, they are unified, they are elevated. On the opposing side, the portrayal shifts dramatically. Figures appear exaggerated, unfamiliar, distorted, almost unrecognizable, and this contrast is not subtle. It's visual, it's immediate, it's constant. The film doesn't just create opposition, it creates contrast at every level. From stylization to interpretation, one way to view this is straightforward. It's part of the film's graphic, stylized approach. Everything is heightened, everything is symbolic, everything is designed for impact. But another interpretation sees something more layered, because when one side is elevated and the other is reduced to abstraction, it can feel less like pure stylization and more like a specific perspective, propaganda or perspective. Some viewers interpret 300 as a modern allegory, a story about resistance versus dominance, about a small force standing against a vast power. And depending on context, those ideas can echo real-world narratives, especially those tied to conflict, power, and identity. In that context, the film can begin to feel like something closer to propaganda, not necessarily by intention, but through the way it frames its world. Others reject that interpretation entirely. They argue that 300 isn't making a political statement, it's simply presenting a subjective version of history, filtered through myth, perspective, and storytelling tradition. And that's where the discussion lives. The role of perspective. One way to understand the film is to see it as a story told from a specific point of view, not objective history, but a retelling shaped by bias, pride, and cultural identity. From that angle, the exaggerated portrayal of the opposing side isn't meant to be accurate. It reflects how they are perceived within the story itself. That interpretation adds context, but it doesn't remove the tension. Because even as a perspective, the imagery remains powerful, and powerful imagery always carries meaning. Cultural sensitivity and representation, the portrayal of the Persian side, has been one of the most debated aspects of the film. Some critics point to how they are depicted as distorted, excessive, or unfamiliar, arguing that it reinforces negative impressions and reduces a complex culture into stylized imagery. Others defend the approach, saying it fits the film's fantasy tone rather than reflecting real-world intent. But the fact that this discussion exists highlights something important. 300 may be stylized, but its imagery is not neutral. Conflict framed as identity. Another layer to this discussion is how the film presents conflict itself. In this world, conflict is not just necessary, it's tied directly to honor, identity, and purpose. The Spartans don't just engage in battle, they define themselves through it, and that framing can be interpreted in different ways. As inspiration, as exaggeration, or as a celebration of confrontation. Again, the meaning depends on the viewer. A film that invites reaction. What makes the film stand out is that it doesn't clearly position itself within these interpretations. It doesn't explain its stance, it doesn't clarify its intent, it presents its world and leaves the audience to decide what it represents. And because of that, reactions vary widely. Some see it as bold, intense, and unapologetic. Others see it as one-sided, exaggerated, and open to criticism. Style doesn't cancel meaning. There's a common argument that because the film is so stylized, it shouldn't be taken seriously on a deeper level. But style doesn't remove meaning. If anything, it can amplify it. Because when ideas are presented through striking visuals and heightened emotion, they become more impactful, not less. And that's why the film continues to generate discussion. Final thought on controversy. In the end, 300 exists in a complex space. It is entertainment. It is stylized fiction. It is a graphic novel brought to life. But it is also a film that draws from real historical inspiration, strong visual contrast, and bold thematic framing. And when those elements come together, they create something that goes beyond simple spectacle. Whether you see it as myth, message, or something in between, one thing is certain. It doesn't just show you a story, it makes you respond to it. And sometimes, that response says as much about the film as the film itself. If you walk into 300 expecting history, the film doesn't just challenge that expectation, it leaves it behind almost immediately. Because very quickly, it becomes clear. This is not a battlefield grounded in realism. This is a battlefield shaped by myth, imagination, and exaggeration. From history to legend, the real story of Thermopylae is already powerful. A small force, an overwhelming opposition, a final stand. But the film doesn't stop there. It takes that foundation and expands it into something larger, stranger, almost surreal. Because in this world, opposition doesn't arrive as ordinary soldiers, it arrives as spectacle. The arrival of the unreal as the opposing forces advance, they don't feel like a conventional army. They feel like something out of a dreamlike vision. Masked warriors moving through shadow, massive figures dominating the battlefield. Distorted forms that blur the line between human and something else. This is where the film fully embraces fantasy, not subtly, not gradually, but with complete confidence. Xerxes. More than a man, at the center of this exaggeration is Xerxes, portrayed by Rodrigo Santoro. He isn't presented as a typical ruler. he is elevated, physically and visually, into something almost beyond human scale, towering. Adorned in gold, covered in intricate details, speaking with a calm, controlled presence, he doesn't feel like a traditional king. He feels like a symbol, a representation of excess, of limitless power, of something beyond ordinary human boundaries, and that design choice shapes everything around him. Creatures of War, the film doesn't just exaggerate its characters, it expands its world with elements that go beyond historical reality. Large creatures, massive animals moving through formations, unusual figures designed to overwhelm visually. These elements aren't included for accuracy, they're included for impact. Each new encounter becomes a new visual experience. A way to expand the scale, a way to push the boundaries of what this world can present. Why the fantasy works for many viewers, this is where 300 becomes more than a traditional war film. Because these elements introduce unpredictability, they move beyond expectation. They make the experience feel larger than life. You're no longer watching a historical recreation. You're watching a myth unfold in real time. And that opens the door for creative freedom. Anything can appear. Anything can happen. The battlefield becomes a space of imagination as much as conflict. The cost of exaggeration, but this approach also brings consequences. The further the film moves into fantasy, the further it moves from emotional grounding. Because when opposition becomes exaggerated and encounters become spectacle, the sense of realism fades, and with it, the sense of authentic stakes. What should feel like a historical moment begins to feel like a stylized sequence, a series of escalating visual moments rather than a grounded struggle. Mythic logic over realism, but that's the core of it. 300 doesn't operate on real-world logic, it operates on mythic logic. In myth, everything is amplified, heroes are idealized, opposition is exaggerated, events are shaped by storytelling. And within that framework, everything makes sense. The scale, the imagery, the impossible moments, they're not meant to be believed, they're meant to be experienced. A world of extremes, this is a film built on extremes. The heroes are perfectly disciplined, the opposition is highly exaggerated. The world exists between beauty and distortion. There's no middle ground, and that's intentional, because 300 isn't interested in balance, it's interested in contrast. Final thought on fantasy and exaggeration. In the end, the fantasy elements aren't a side detail. They are part of the film's identity. They transform the story from a historical moment into a visual legend. And whether that transformation feels exciting or excessive depends entirely on what you expect. If you want realism, this will feel like distortion. But if you accept the film on its own terms, then the exaggeration, the surreal imagery, the heightened world becomes exactly what it's meant to be. Not history, but myth brought to life. There's a fine line in cinema between something that feels epic and something that feels overwhelming for the wrong reasons. 300 exists directly on that line. And depending on how you experience it, it either becomes a visceral, unforgettable spectacle or a film that struggles under the weight of its own ambition. The power of spectacle at its strongest, the film delivers pure cinematic intensity. Everything is heightened, everything is amplified, everything is designed to leave an impression. The visuals are bold, the sound is powerful, the performances are forceful, the battles are relentless, there's no hesitation in its tone. It doesn't build slowly, it establishes itself immediately, and for many viewers, that's exactly why it works. It's immersive, it's direct, it pulls you into its world and keeps you there. A film that commits fully. One of the film's greatest strengths is its complete commitment. It doesn't try to balance tones, it doesn't shift between styles, it doesn't soften its edges, it commits fully to its identity. This isn't a subtle film. It isn't restrained, it isn't designed to appeal to everyone. It knows what it is, and it leans into that with full confidence. And there's something compelling about that, because even when it pushes too far, it does so with purpose. When spectacle becomes saturation, but here's the challenge. When everything is intense, nothing feels truly intense anymore. When every moment is treated like a peak, the sense of progression begins to fade. You stop anticipating impact because it's always present. The spectacle doesn't build, it remains constant. And over time, that constant intensity can feel overwhelming. The lack of contrast. Great films often rely on contrast. Quiet moments that make louder ones feel stronger. Stillness that makes movement feel faster. Silence that gives sound more meaning. 300 rarely offers that contrast. It operates at a high level of intensity almost all the time. And without those shifts, the experience can feel flat, not because it lacks energy, but because it lacks variation. Style versus substance. This is where the idea of style over substance begins to surface. Because while the film is undeniably stylish, the question becomes, what lies beneath it? For some viewers, the style is enough. The visuals, the action, the energy, it all creates a complete experience. But for others, that style begins to feel like a surface layer, a way of maintaining engagement without offering deeper substance. And that's where the tone shifts from epic to excessive. Moments of alignment. What makes this more interesting is that the film does have moments where everything comes together. Moments where visuals, music, performance, and timing align perfectly. And in those moments, the film becomes exactly what it aims to be, a modern epic, a visual legend, a story told with confidence and clarity, but those moments exist within repetition. And that repetition can reduce their overall impact. Audience divide. This is why the film creates such a clear divide. Some viewers experience it as bold, engaging, and unforgettable. Others see it as loud, repetitive, and lacking depth. And both perspectives are valid, because the film contains both qualities. It is impressive and excessive, engaging and overwhelming. A film of extremes. Ultimately, 300 doesn't operate in moderation. It doesn't aim for balance. It doesn't aim for subtlety. It exists in extremes, and that is both its greatest strength and its most noticeable limitation. Final thought on tone. In the end, the tone defines everything. If you embrace its intensity, it becomes a powerful spectacle. If you resist it, it can feel overwhelming, because the film doesn't ask you to meet it halfway. It moves forward boldly, directly, and without pause. And the real question becomes, do you get carried by that energy, or do you feel lost within it? To fully understand 300, you have to look at where it stands. Not just as an individual film, but within a broader cinematic context, because it didn't arrive in isolation. It arrived at a time when historical epics were regaining popularity and comic-inspired storytelling was reshaping visual style. And somehow it positioned itself between both. Between two worlds. On one side, you had traditional historical epics like Gladiator, grounded, emotional, focused on character and realism. Stories driven by human struggle and political depth. On the other side, you had stylized comic adaptations like Sin City, bold, graphic, highly exaggerated, driven by visual identity rather than realism. 300 doesn't choose between them, it blends them. It takes the scale and setting of a historical epic and presents it through the visual language of a graphic novel, and that combination is what makes it feel so distinct. A new kind of epic. Traditional epics aim for immersion through realism. They build worlds that feel lived in. They ground their characters in emotional complexity. They allow the story to unfold with weight and consequence. 300 takes a different path. It doesn't try to make the world feel real. It tries to make the world feel legendary. It removes realism and replaces it with stylization. The result is something that still feels epic, but in a different way. An epic of imagery, tone, and sensation. The influence of graphic storytelling. This is where the influence of Frank Miller becomes undeniable. The film doesn't just adapt his story, it adapts his style. The framing, the contrast, the exaggerated forms, the dramatic poses, everything feels like it has been translated directly from illustration to screen. And unlike many adaptations that soften their style for wider appeal, 300 commits fully. It doesn't dilute, it doesn't hold back, it commits fully to that visual identity. Standing apart from other epics because of that, 300 stands apart from other films in its genre. It doesn't feel like Troy, which leans into historical drama. It doesn't feel like Kingdom of Heaven, which focuses on political and emotional depth. It doesn't fully align with traditional war films that emphasize realism and strategy. Instead, it creates its own space. A place where history becomes myth, where conflict becomes spectacle, where characters become symbols. Comparison to other stylized films. At the same time, it shares similarities with highly stylized cinema. Films that prioritize visual identity over narrative complexity. In that sense, 300 feels closer to works like Sin City, where the frame itself becomes the storytelling tool. But even then, it pushes further. Because while Sin City operates within a noir-inspired aesthetic, this film moves into something more raw, more forceful, more focused on impact than atmosphere. A bridge between eras. What makes 300 significant is how it helped signal a shift. It showed that audiences would respond to films that looked different. That style could be a primary draw. That visual identity could carry a film just as much as narrative. And after its release, its influence became visible. More slow-motion-driven action, more stylized presentation, more emphasis on visual tone. It didn't just fit into a genre, it pushed it in a new direction. Not easily replicated, and yet, despite its influence, it remains difficult to replicate. Because its impact isn't just about technique, it's about commitment. Many films borrow its style, but few commit to it as completely. That's why it still stands out, not because it's flawless, but because it's unmistakable. Final thought on genre context in the end, 300 exists between categories. It isn't purely a historical epic. It isn't purely a comic book adaptation. It's something in between, a hybrid, a fusion. A film that takes elements from both and reshapes them into something new. And whether you see that as innovation or exaggeration, one thing is clear. It didn't follow the rules of its genre. It reshaped them. There are films made to be watched, and then there are films made to be experienced in a crowd. 300 belongs to the second category, because this isn't just a movie, it's a spectacle designed for shared reaction. Cinema as a shared experience from the moment it begins, the film feels built for an audience. Not a quiet, reflective audience, but a reactive one. The kind that leans forward during intense moments. The kind that feels the energy in the room. The kind that responds physically to what's unfolding on screen. This is a film that invites reactions, surprise, moments of disbelief, even amusement at its most exaggerated extremes. It's not subtle, it doesn't need to be, because its goal is simple: keep the audience engaged constantly. Designed for immediate impact, everything about the film is built around instant connection. The visuals are bold. The action is continuous. The characters are easy to understand. There's no need to analyze deeply in the moment. You know who the heroes are. You know what they represent. You understand what's at stake, and that clarity makes it accessible. This is the kind of film you can enter at any point and immediately feel something. The power of the big screen, but where 300 truly stands out, is on a large screen. Because this isn't a film designed for small, contained viewing. It's designed for scale, the wide compositions, the expansive confrontations, the towering figures. All of it is meant to fill your entire field of vision. On a smaller screen, you observe it. On a larger screen, you feel immersed in it. IMAX and sensory immersion in formats like IMAX, that effect becomes even stronger. The visuals expand, the sound intensifies. The details become more overwhelming. Every impact feels louder. Every movement feels larger. Every image feels more imposing. And suddenly, the film isn't just in front of you, it surrounds you. Why it works for mass audiences, part of what makes 300 so widely appealing is its directness. It doesn't rely on complex storytelling. It doesn't demand deep analysis. It operates on instinct, action, energy, visual intensity. These are universal elements, and because of that, it connects with a broad audience, especially those looking for something fast, engaging, and visually striking. Targeting a specific energy at the same time, the film clearly leans into a specific type of appeal. High energy, forceful tone, physical dominance. It taps into a very particular emotional space, one built around intensity, power, and spectacle. And for viewers who connect with that, the film delivers exactly what they're looking for. The role of spectacle in entertainment, what the film understands, is that spectacle itself can be enough. Not every experience needs complexity. Not every story needs depth. Sometimes the audience simply wants to be impressed, to be overwhelmed, to be entertained, and 300 fully embraces that idea, where it divides viewers, but that same approach is also where it divides people. Because while some viewers are fully drawn into the spectacle, others begin to notice its limits. Once the visual impact settles, once the repetition becomes clear, the question becomes, is the experience enough on its own? First watch versus repeat viewing. This becomes especially noticeable when comparing first and repeat viewings. The first time, everything feels fresh. The visuals hit strongly. The sequences feel intense. The experience feels immersive. But on repeat viewing, the structure becomes more visible. The surprises fade. The spectacle feels more familiar. And for some viewers, that reduces its overall effect. Final thought on audience appeal in the end. 300 knows exactly what kind of experience it wants to deliver. It isn't subtle. It isn't complex. It aims to be big, bold, unforgettable. And in the right environment, on a large screen, surrounded by a responsive audience, it succeeds. Because this isn't just something you watch, it's something you experience together, and that's where its impact is strongest. Before most people ever saw 300, they had already experienced it through its trailers, because the marketing didn't just introduce the film, it defined it. A trailer that became an event. The trailers were explosive, short, focused, visually striking. They delivered everything instantly: the slow-motion sequences, the stylized visuals, the memorable lines, the overwhelming scale. It wasn't just promotion, it was impact. And for many viewers, that first exposure created strong expectations. This wasn't going to be just another historical film. This was going to be something bold, something different, something unforgettable. When the best moments come early, but here's where things become more complex. Because the trailer didn't just set expectations, it revealed a lot. Some of the film's most memorable lines, already familiar. Some of its most striking visuals, already seen. Some of its biggest moments, already experienced in condensed form. and for a film that relies heavily on individual moments of impact, that matters. The problem of familiarity: when you enter a film and recognize its key moments before they happen, the experience shifts. You're no longer discovering, you're anticipating. Instead of reacting, you're waiting. And for some viewers, that reduced the intensity, because when those major moments arrive, they don't land with the same force, not because they lack strength, but because they're expected. Expectation versus reality: the marketing promised something relentless, a continuous wave of action, a steady escalation of spectacle, a film that would keep building. And while 300 does deliver strong visuals and memorable sequences, it doesn't always maintain that level of momentum throughout. There are pauses, there are repeated patterns, there are moments where the energy stabilizes, and for viewers expecting constant escalation, that can feel like a drop. The weight of hype: this is the challenge with heavily promoted films. The greater the anticipation, the more demanding the experience becomes, because audiences aren't just watching, they're comparing the film to the version they imagined. And if the reality doesn't align with that expectation, even a solid film can feel underwhelming. Different reactions, same film. This is why responses vary so widely. Some viewers arrive with no expectations and come away impressed. Others arrive expecting something groundbreaking and feel disappointed. Same film. Different expectations. A film built on moments. What makes this even more interesting is that 300 is built on moments. Iconic visuals, memorable lines, striking sequences. And those are exactly the elements the trailer focused on. So in a way, the marketing was accurate. It showed what the film offers, but it also compressed that experience into something more intense than the full film sustains. Delivery versus perception. So did the film deliver on its promise? That depends on how you define that promise. If you expected strong visuals, stylized action, and memorable moments, it delivers. If you expected constant escalation and surprise, it may feel limited, because the film maintains its identity, but doesn't always expand beyond what it establishes early. Final thought on hype and delivery: in the end, 300 is a film where the trailer and the experience are closely connected, perhaps too closely. The marketing captured its essence, but also revealed its peak moments. And that creates a unique viewing experience, because when you finally watch the film, you're not discovering what it is, you're confirming what you already saw, and whether that feels satisfying or limiting depends entirely on your expectations. Because sometimes the biggest challenge for a film isn't what it shows, it's what the audience expects before it even begins. Some films draw you in gradually, others build over time. 300 doesn't wait. It engages immediately and maintains that grip through intensity. Instant engagement from the opening moments. The film establishes its rhythm. Bold visuals, heavy sound, clear conflict. There's no confusion about what you're watching. No slow transition into tone or identity. You're immersed instantly. And that directness is one of its strongest qualities. You don't need to analyze, you don't need to wait. It knows exactly what it is, and it delivers immediately. Entertainment through spectacle. The primary source of engagement is spectacle. The battles, the visuals, the pacing of individual sequences. These elements hold your attention, even when the narrative remains simple. You're consistently given something to watch, something to react to, something to experience. And on a first viewing, that can be more than enough. The first-time experience on first watch, especially on a large screen, the film feels powerful. Everything is new, everything is intense, everything feels larger than life. The stylization is fresh, the action feels impactful, the experience feels immersive. Even without complex storytelling, the presentation carries you through. And that's why many viewers leave with a strong impression. The shift on rewatch but repeat viewing changes the experience, because once you've seen it, you understand the structure, you recognize the rhythm, you anticipate what's coming. And that familiarity changes how it feels. The slow-motion sequences feel less striking. The repeated patterns become more noticeable. The simplicity of the narrative becomes more apparent. What once felt intense can begin to feel predictable. Spectacle versus longevity. This is the central tension. 300 is built on spectacle, and spectacle has a different kind of longevity. It makes a strong first impression. But it doesn't always evolve over time. Films built on character depth or layered storytelling often reveal more with each viewing. This film presents the same experience in the same way each time. Moments that still work. That said, certain elements continue to hold their impact. Individual sequences, memorable lines, visually striking moments. These still work because they rely on execution, not surprise. Even when anticipated, they deliver on a visual level. Different types of engagement. It's important to understand how the film engages its audience. Not primarily through emotion, not primarily through intellectual depth, but through sensation, energy, intensity. immediate reaction. And for viewers who connect with that style, the film remains engaging, even on repeat. Why some return to it, some audiences revisit 300 for the same reason they revisit other visually driven action films. For the experience, the battles, the imagery, the overall tone. It's not about discovering something new, it's about revisiting something familiar. Why others don't for others, a single viewing is enough. Because without deeper layers to explore, the film doesn't offer much beyond what it already presents. A second viewing doesn't add meaning, it simply repeats the same experience. And if that experience didn't fully connect the first time, it's unlikely to change later. Final thought on entertainment value in the end, 300 is built for immediate impact. It engages quickly. It delivers consistently. It leaves a strong first impression, but its long-term value depends on what you're looking for. If you want spectacle, it delivers. If you want depth that grows over time, it may feel limited. Because this film isn't designed to evolve with each viewing. It's designed to hit once and hit with force. For all the discussion surrounding 300, for all the criticism, the debate, the division, there's one thing that stands out. This film does several things extremely well, and when it works with impact. A visual identity you can't ignore. The most immediate strength is its visual identity. It looks like nothing else. From the color palette to the lighting, from composition to digital environments, every frame feels deliberate. This isn't a film that blends into its genre. It stands out instantly, one image and you recognize it. That level of visual distinction is rare, and the film builds its entire experience around it. Action that feels designed. Then there's the action. Not chaotic, not unclear, but controlled, choreographed, and precise. The sequences are structured, the movement is readable. You always understand what's happening, even during large-scale encounters. And more importantly, it feels impactful. Every motion is emphasized. Every action is intentional. This isn't movement for the sake of motion. It's action built around presentation. Commitment to style. One of the film's strongest qualities is its commitment. It doesn't hesitate. It doesn't hold back. It doesn't try to soften itself for broader appeal. It chooses a direction and follows it completely. That level of confidence gives it a clear identity. Even when it goes too far, it does so with purpose. A strong central presence at the center, Gerard Butler delivers a performance that anchors the film. It's bold, it's intense, it's memorable. He brings a presence that aligns perfectly with the tone, not subtle but effective. And within this kind of film, that's exactly what's needed. Technical craftsmanship, the technical execution across the board is strong. The digital environments create a consistent world. The costumes and props add texture and detail. The makeup and design establish clear visual contrast between opposing sides. Everything works together. There's a unified visual language, and the film remains consistent within it. That cohesion allows the stylization to feel intentional rather than random. A clear, accessible narrative while the story is simple. That simplicity works in its favor. It's easy to follow, easy to understand, easy to engage with. You're never confused. You always know what's happening and why. And that clarity makes the film accessible to a wide audience. Memorable moments and lasting impact. Perhaps the most important strength is this. It creates moments that stay with you, images that linger, lines that echo, sequences that feel larger than the film itself. These aren't just scenes, they're impressions. And even if the film has limitations, those moments are strong enough to define its legacy. A unique place in cinema, 300 doesn't just succeed on its own terms. It established a distinct place in modern cinema. It demonstrated that visual style could carry a film. That audiences would respond to bold, exaggerated aesthetics. It didn't follow genre conventions, it reshaped them. Final thought on strengths in the end. Its strengths come down to one idea: impact. It may not be subtle. It may not be balanced. It may not be traditionally deep, but it is powerful. It knows what it wants to be, and it delivers that with complete confidence. And that's why, even years later, it remains memorable. Not for everything it attempted, but for what it achieved exceptionally well. Every film has flaws, but in 300, those flaws are just as visible as its strengths. They sit side by side, equally bold, equally impossible to ignore. Because for everything the film does right, there are clear areas where it falls short. Style over substance. The most common criticism is straightforward. The film prioritizes style over substance. The visuals are striking. The action is memorable. The presentation is distinctive. But beneath that surface, the narrative remains thin. It doesn't expand. It doesn't deepen. It doesn't offer layers that evolve over time. What you see is largely what you get. A narrative that doesn't expand the core premise is strong. A small force standing against overwhelming opposition. But the film doesn't build significantly beyond that idea. There's limited narrative progression. No substantial expansion of themes as the story unfolds. No sense of shifting stakes in unexpected ways. Instead, it reinforces the same concept, again and again, and over time, that repetition becomes noticeable. Lack of character depth. Another key limitation lies in characterization. The characters are iconic but not complex. They represent ideas, strength, honor, defiance, but rarely move beyond them. There's little internal conflict, little emotional vulnerability, little sense of growth, and because of that, it becomes difficult to fully connect with them. You admire them, but you don't always feel them. Emotional distance. This leads to a broader issue. Emotional engagement. 300 delivers impact, visually, sonically, physically, but emotionally, it often remains at a distance. Moments that should feel heavy feel more like spectacle. Moments that should feel personal feel symbolic instead. And while that aligns with the film's mythic tone, it also limits its emotional strength. Repetition in structure and style. The film's structure is another area where limitations appear. It follows a clear pattern: build-up, speech, battle, slow motion, repeat. At first, this rhythm is effective, but as the film continues, it becomes predictable. The same techniques are used again and again, especially slow motion. And what once felt distinctive begins to feel overused. Over-reliance on slow motion is one of the film's defining tools, but it also becomes one of its most excessive. Instead of highlighting key moments, it becomes the default, and when everything is emphasized, nothing truly stands out. It slows momentum, it reduces urgency, it turns action into repetition. Pacing imbalance. Despite the constant action, the pacing isn't always consistent. There are stretches where the energy drops, but not in a way that adds depth. The quieter scenes don't provide enough emotional or narrative development to justify the slowdown. So instead of creating contrast, they create gaps. Dialogue limitations. The writing also contributes to these weaknesses. While some lines are memorable, much of the dialogue feels overly stylized, repetitive, limited in emotional range. It stays within a narrow tone, rarely expanding into something more nuanced. And because of that, it doesn't always support the performances as effectively as it could. Limited realism and reduced stakes. The film's stylization also affects its sense of realism. The Spartans are presented as nearly unstoppable. The opposition is often exaggerated or abstract, and this creates a disconnect. Because when characters feel invulnerable, the sense of danger feels reduced. The stakes are clear, but not always felt. Controversial representation. Another significant concern lies in how the opposing side is portrayed. Their depiction, distorted, exaggerated, and highly stylized, has drawn criticism. While it aligns with the film's visual approach, it also raises questions about cultural representation, stereotyping, underlying interpretation. It's an aspect that extends beyond storytelling and into how the film is perceived. Excess without restraint. Ultimately, many of the film's weaknesses come from a single source: a lack of restraint. The visuals are pushed, the action is extended. The tone remains constant, and while that creates impact, it also creates imbalance. There's very little contrast, very little subtlety, very little variation. Final thought on weaknesses. In the end, 300 is a film of extremes. Its strengths are bold, but its weaknesses are equally visible. It delivers spectacle, but sacrifices depth. It creates memorable moments, but struggles to build a consistently evolving experience. And that leaves it in a unique position: a film that impresses, but doesn't always connect. A film that stands out, but doesn't always hold over time. Because while it knows exactly what it wants to be, it never fully becomes more than that. So after everything, the spectacle, the style, the discussion, the impact, what is it really? A film that chooses one path. This is not a film trying to be everything. It doesn't aim for deep character exploration. It doesn't aim for historical precision. It doesn't aim for subtle storytelling. It chooses one path: style, intensity, and visual impact, and follows it completely. There's no hesitation in that decision, no compromise. And that becomes both its greatest strength and its most noticeable limitation. When it works, when 300 works, it feels powerful. The visuals land, the action flows, the energy builds. There are moments where everything aligns: image, sound, performance, and the film becomes exactly what it aims to be: a modern myth, a cinematic legend, an experience built on impact. In those moments, it's hard not to be impressed. When it doesn't, but those moments don't carry the entire experience. Because once the spectacle settles, what remains is more limited. The story is simple, the characters are thin, the pacing becomes repetitive. And the film doesn't always offer something deeper to hold on to. It delivers intensity, but not always progression. A film that divides, and that's why it creates such strong reactions. Some viewers see it as bold, memorable, and visually striking. Others see it as excessive, repetitive, and lacking substance. Both responses are valid. Because the film contains both qualities, what it ultimately becomes in the end, 300 isn't about balance. It's about commitment. It commits to its style. It commits to its tone. It commits to its identity. And it never steps away from that. It doesn't ask you to analyze deeply. It asks you to experience. Verdict: it is not a perfect film. It is not even a complete one in the traditional sense, but it is a distinct one. A film that knows exactly what it wants to be and delivers it with confidence. If you're looking for depth, complexity, and layered storytelling, you may feel unsatisfied, but if you're looking for bold visuals, stylized action, a film that leaves a strong impression, then it delivers exactly that. Final line: because in the end, it isn't a film you judge only by what it lacks. It's a film you remember for how it made you feel in the moment, and whether that feeling is awe or fatigue is entirely up to you.